And welcome to the channel, chaps and chapettes, for another episode of Buggering About with Old Buildings. So relax, sit back, and enjoy the show with a nice cup of tea. St Anne's on the Sea, my hometown. We're going to take a look through at some of the history of the town and some of the iconic buildings. A lot of these buildings I, of course, do a lot of preservation and repair work on. And we start off our journey talking about when the town itself had its tramway, which is long since gone. Now, when the trams first came to the town, of course, they were running between the small fishing town of Lytham, just down the coast, passing through the village of Ansdell, through St Anne's on the Sea, and ending up in the seaside resort of Blackpool. Quite some distance. The trams are long gone now, sadly. But in the day, when they were new, when they were first invented, they were a thing for the gentry and the middle classes. And the poorer working classes started to walk, or if you were lucky enough, go around on a bicycle. This little building here was originally a tram stop. Now, when I was a small boy, it was a tourist information place, and the board you can see there used to press a button on it, and various parts of the map would light up showing different parts of the town. That's now changed again, and it's been extended out, and it's now, I believe, a cafe type tea room. And if you look to the bottom right hand corner of this picture, you'll see the building itself as the tram stop back in its day. So the trams will go thundering down what is today's Clifton Drive, which was back then just a road through the dunes, making their way to the holiday resort of Blackpool, which, of course, back then was a very popular and respected place. So, what did we have before St Anne's on the Sea existed? Well, it was just a void, I suppose you could say, between the fishing village or town of Lytham and the seaside town of Blackpool. It was just an outcrop of farms and a small village known as Kilgrimmel. The picture shows one of the remaining cottages, I believe back in around the 1950s, which are now long gone. It's now a golf course. The town outgrew the village, and of course, some of the lovely old buildings of the town have now been demolished and replaced with modern buildings. This one in the picture here used to be known as the St Anne's Hotel. There's still a pub there. They've built a new one, but it was a lovely old building in its day. And here we have some of the buildings that replaced the lovely old Victorian St Anne's Hotel. However, they did keep part of that old hotel. There is a bar, used to be known as the Rat Pit or Burlington Bertie's, which was below the St Anne's Hotel. And it's a Grade 1 listed structure, and they managed to save it by building over the top of it. Lovely old place to visit. Or it used to be, as it's now closed down. But it's protected, which is a good thing. But I believe it's got one of the oldest, longest tiled bars in Europe, so I'm led to believe. But it's a fascinating place, and I used to enjoy going out the odd pint in there after work. So, how did the town become St Anne's? What started it off? Well, it's quite simple. A company was set up called the St Anne's Land Company, and it was a group of wealthy businessmen and the local Clifton family that decided to sell off plots of their estate, which was the Clifton estate. And they sold these plots off for people to build houses, only not just like today where they build half a dozen boxes. These were to build houses for the wealthy, the people that own mills and factories and businesses in general. Well, very wealthy people. And one by one, these houses were built and they started forming the town. And at the same time, they built the local parish church. A railway was put in and a train station, and the town started to grow. St Anne's on the Sea eventually became a very popular spot to go and enjoy the sea air, have a bit of a paddle, or even a dip in the sea. Of course, St Anne's is on the Irish Sea coast, and it can be a bit chilly at times. However, it was in the days of stiff upper lip, old boy, and people did enjoy a swim. It was said to be good for your health coming to the seaside for the fresh air. And I suppose, really, the cities were full of mills and smoking chimneys and a lot of air pollution. They even advertised the fact that it was a healthy environment to visit. And some doctors would recommend that people with, for example, consumption to go and visit the seaside for the fresh air. So slowly but surely, the town gained its fame for being a bit of a touristy spot. So things like the old St Anne's Pier were constructed. The pier was a grand structure built out of timber and cast iron with a dash of lead and glass. It was a beautiful thing with theatres on the end, a cafeteria, walkways, benches, and shelters. Perfect for the Victorian and Edwardian gentry to spend a pleasant Sunday afternoon strolling down the pier. When I was a small boy, my mother used to take me onto the old pier, and we go to the end where there was a bird aviary with tropical birds chirping away, and a big brown stuffed bear. The bear used to scare me. I knew it wasn't real, but it still scared me. But we go into the cafeteria, and we'd sit at the end looking out into the Ribble estuary. There you could see ships going backward and forward, to and fro, Preston docks. And I'd sit there with me glass of orange juice and my paper straw and a wagon wheel or a blue ribbon or something like that, and wonder what was on those ships. Where'd they come from? They come from exotic places like Africa and Australia. Who knows? Yep, it was a magical place to grow up. Playing on the beach for hours and hours and hours. And the odd ice cream. Full of sand, of course. But in the 1970s, disaster struck when a huge fire broke out on the end of the pier and totally destroyed the theatres and the surrounding buildings, rendering them useless and unaccessible. Of course, one of the first restoration jobs I ever worked on was on the pier at St Anne's with my father. And we did a lot of redecking using a timber known as OPP. Very hard. We had to drill every single hole for every single nail. I'll never forget it. What an experience. But that was kind of the beginnings of my history of restoring old structures. And of course, the pier's still there today, and it's still very popular with the tourists that come to the town each summer. Yes, the pier in its day would have been a very popular destination for the tourists and locals alike. If you wanted a cup of tea or an ice cream or even a pint of ale, the pier was the place to go. And of course, you could go down there and watch a show or two. And I believe the shows were running right up until the fire in the 1970s. Lots of famous people walked the stage of the Pier Theatre. A short walk down from the pier, we have the monument, the statue to the brave men of the lifeboat. The men from this particular lifeboat all perished one stormy winter's night. A big storm had hit, and the lifeboat from St Anne's, from Lytham, and from Southport all attended the rescue of the crew from the Mexico, which had run aground on a sandbank just short of Preston docks. Unfortunately, disaster struck, and all the crew of the St Anne's lifeboat perished. The bodies were later recovered, and they were put on display in the Clifton Arms Hotel in Lytham as a curiosity. The Victorians were very, very gorish. Also, next to the pier, we have the old bandstand. At some point in its history, wooden window frames and thick plate glass were put into the openings of the bandstand. And in the 1980s, again with my father, we restored it back to its former glory, as it is today, looking prestige with its cast iron columns. Of course, it now stands proud of place on the promenade in St Anne's. And on some lovely sunny summer afternoons, a band will pump up the old brass and play a tune or two for the tourists. And of course, here, sometime in around the 1950s, we can see the old bandstand with its timber window frames and its thick plate glass. I suppose back then it was classed as old fashioned and not really worthy anymore as a bandstand. So the conversion into a bit of a shelter took place, and that was then the history of the old bandstand until me and my dad got hold of it and put it back to its Victorian glory. In the 1970s, the glory days as St Anne's being a holiday resort were well and truly over. The Spanish holiday had taken over, as with most seaside resorts in the UK. It wasn't until we had the COVID outbreak that St Anne's really started to pick up as a tourist spot once again. And it's now thriving, back to what it was before the 1970s. So let's go back in time now to the Victorian era and have a look what the town was like before it became a modern seaside holiday destination. The town centre, or the square as it is commonly known, started off mainly as houses, very big houses, very posh houses, with gardens. And over time, those gardens became walkways because a lot of the houses became shops because obviously the town was new and lacked any kind of shop or store. So, from umbrella shops to hardware shops and everything in between, slowly but surely, the square was born. Retail was the thing for the area, servicing all the big grand houses that were springing up left, right, and centre in St Anne's. As the town grew, it was realised that a sewerage system was needed. However, some of the businessmen that were investing in the growth of St Anne's didn't really want to spend money on wasteful things like sewerage systems. What's wrong with a cesspit? But a lot of the investors in these businesses decided that sewerage system was needed. And if one wasn't built, they'd pull their money. So it was then decided that a sewerage system and sewerage works were to be built, and the raw sewage had be pumped directly into the Irish Sea. So St Anne's was growing fast and becoming a bustling little Lancashire town, a great place to live and a great place to holiday. If you look closely at the picture, you can see some of the names on the shops and sort of figure out what the businesses were, what they were selling, what they were offering the local public. From vegetables to fish to meat to shoes, clothes, umbrellas, tobacconists, sweet shops, you name it, they were all springing up in the new town centre, or the square as we now refer it as. So, what happened to all the farms and cottages that were in the area? Well, some of them still remained, and they remained right up, really, until the mid 1980s, when the last of the few farms finally closed down, and the land ended up being redeveloped for new housing. Of course, a lot of the old cottages still remain, be it that they've been turned into nice modern houses. For example, one of the cottages that we've personally worked on is the old Trawboat Inn. It wasn't so much a cottage, it was the local inn before St Anne's was built. But in this particular picture here, you can see a cottage that still remains, and it's more or less opposite the old Trawboat. And it used to be the smithy, the blacksmith's shop. And the blacksmith, he'd have been doing the tool making for the local farmers, the local fishermen. He'd have been shoeing horses and all that type of stuff. He probably strolled over at the end of a hard day's graft in the smithy to the Trawboat Inn for a nice, fresh pint of ale. Your working class were all living at the back end of the town. The big posh houses were obviously for the wealthy, and the workforce for the town we live in. Well, probably at least a mile away. Of course, the town I remember from when I was younger has completely changed. The buildings are the same, but the businesses have changed. The way the town is has changed. But I can remember back to the good old days of the town when we had the local chippy and the knew your name. You were in the butcher's and he had your meat ready for you before you asked because he knew you, he knew what you wanted. Well, those days are sadly gone now with the introduction of the supermarket and the mass chain stores in this, that, and the other. But let's have a look back now at what the town looked like when I was growing up. Of course, I can remember being dragged in this butcher shop as a child by my mother when we go faster pumps on a Saturday afternoon. And really, I wanted to be home playing, not going shopping. I recall there was always rabbits and pheasants hung up in the shop window, and I'd stand there fascinated as a boy, looking at the dead rabbits and the dead pheasants. And of course, you could buy your beef dripping back in your gravy, or they went on your dad's butties for work. The local council, they had some ground gardeners, and they used to tend these flower beds right in the town centre and keep them in prestige condition. And in the summer, there was always this smell of the plants. You could smell the flowers. It was an amazing smell, especially on a hot day. But of course, they've gone now, unfortunately, and it's quite a controversial thing locally. And people say that they should have put them back. They should never have taken them in the first place. But modernisation, etc., and local authorities, and you know how that goes. And the old concrete bus shelters, they always had a strange smell of gents' toilets around them. But you get your bus back home from the town centre from one of these shelters, and you could also catch the old 11C, which would take you into Blackpool. Well, that just about rounds us up with this little tour of St Anne's past and present. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. Something a little bit different for you. And if you have enjoyed watching it, please drop us a comment or two because we could do a few more in-depth videos on particular buildings and the history of them and that kind of thing. So if you've enjoyed it, as usual, don't forget those big thumbs up, hit the like button, and welcome to all of our new subscribers. I hope you're enjoying the channel. And if you are enjoying the channel and you're not a new subscriber and you haven't subscribed yet, please feel free to subscribe. It is free, there's no charge. YouTube don't charge you, and I don't charge you, which means it's free entertainment. So subscribe if you want to. And we'll see you next week, back out on the job, doing a bit more buggering about with old buildings. Thanks for watching. See you next time.